Genesis is the book of origination. It describes the beginning of heaven and earth, the beginning of man, the beginning of sin, the beginning of Israel. In fact, the word Genesis itself means origins. Exodus is the book of salvation. Israel fell into sin and bondage in Egypt, but God sent a deliverer to set his people free, and Exodus points to the deliverer who then set us free. Leviticus, that we looked at last week, is the book of dedication. At Mount Sinai, God taught his people to make sacrifices, exactly how to do it, and how to offer up their worship. He told them in a nutshell that they were to be holy as he is holy. And they began tabernacle worship. Which brings us to Numbers. Now, if Genesis is origination, and Exodus is salvation, and Leviticus is dedication, Numbers is the book of organization. Now that the nation has been set free and the people have dedicated themselves to God and made sacrifices, God wants his people to camp together and march together in an orderly fashion on their way to the promised land. So you really could say it is the book, Numbers, of organization, as you will see as we slowly go through it. Now, some people have asked, why the name Numbers? Kind of an odd name for a book. Well, one of the reasons is, no kidding, there are a lot of numbers in the book. And the reason there are a lot of numbers in the book is because there were censuses taken of the people in the book. And in just a second, you'll see just how many people were part of each tribe. The Greek name, by the way, for the fourth book of the Bible, the New Testament was written in Greek, in Aramaic, but Greek. The Greek name for the fourth book in the Bible is arithmeo. You know what English word we get from that? Arithmetic, that's right. And its title in Latin is numero. You know what word we get from numero in English? Well, of course you do, numbers. So if you're squirming in your seat, worried that this is going to be a math lesson with a lot of numbers and you don't do too well in math, don't sweat it. It's not going to be. There's much more to the book of Numbers than just numbers. In fact, I don't think it should be the title at all. I really don't. In the Hebrew Bible, the book is titled, in the Hebrew Bible, the book is actually titled In the Wilderness. And that's what the book describes, the nation's wilderness wandering. Had I been naming it, I would have named it How to Turn a 12-Day Walk into a 40-Year Death March. Because that would be a good, legitimate name for it. How to turn a 12-day walk into a 40-day death march. Because the book of Numbers reveals the reasons why the Hebrews failed to enter the land that God promised them and why they died in the desert. And so the first verse says, a year after Israel's departure from Egypt, the Lord spoke to Moses in the tabernacle in the wilderness of Sinai. On the first day of the second month of that year is when he speaks to them. So that tells us a lot. That tells us it's been 13 months exactly. A year, he said, and then another month passes. So it has been 13 months exactly since Israel's exodus from Egypt. So it's not really hard to figure this out. They spent a month and a half after they crossed the Red Sea miraculously. They spent a month and a half traveling to the foot of Mount Sinai. The next 10 and a half months, they were at the foot of Mount Sinai where God gave to them the law and the blueprints for the tabernacle. Then they spent a little over a month erecting the tabernacle and its furniture, but now it's time to march. It is 13 months after leaving Egypt, and they're ready to march to the Promised Land. But to march effectively and in unison, you have to be organized. So they are told to take a census and organize themselves. And I don't know how well you can see this, but everywhere they stop with their encampment, the tabernacle is to be in the center of the camp, and there are to be 3 tribes on each side of the tabernacle. So they march in a specific order with their tribe. When they camp on a side of the tabernacle that has been assigned to them. God, in other words, even wanted the march to be organized because he is not a God of chaos or confusion, but of organization. Now, I don't know again how well you can see this. Judah, by far, was the largest tribe. Manasseh was the smallest tribe. If you could see closely, you would see that one tribe is not numbered at all there. That's the tribe of Levi, because the Levites were going to be the priestly tribe and minister to God. They weren't going to go into battle. The Levites, God told them, had holy hands to minister, not bloody hands to fight. Now, ordinarily, as I said a moment ago, it took about 2 weeks, 11 or 12 days, to journey from Mount Sinai to Canaan on foot. But as we will see today, it took the nation 40 years. 40 years. Verse 1 of Hebrews 11 says, the people began to complain about their hardship, and the Lord heard everything they said. Do you know, if you can look this up on Google if you'd like, not right now, I'd appreciate, but the odds of being struck by lightning are 1 in 2 million. I've known a lot of people, tens of thousands of people down through the years. I've never known anybody struck by lightning. The odds of being struck by lightning are 1 in 2 million people, unless you're grumbling and complaining all the time about the Lord and the provisions that he has given you. And then the odds sort of increase dramatically here. When the people grumbled, the Lord got ticked off. Perhaps the malcontents were on the outskirt of the camp and huddled together to sort of roast Moses, and instead, they are the ones who get roasted. The Lord's anger blazed against them, and he sent a fire to rage among them, and he destroyed some of the people in the outskirts of the camp. Now that's important to remember here. Very important to remember who, you're going to see this in a minute, who gets destroyed here and why. So, God has mercy on the surviving complainers and whiners, but here is the warning to us. If you keep up a disgruntled attitude, you may get burned. Maybe not physically, but you may get burned. God may help with that, or you may just sort of burn yourself up with that kind of an attitude. So after this fiery judgment, you would think that the complaining stopped, wouldn't you? But you would be wrong. The next verse says, then the foreign rabble who were traveling with the Israelites began to crave the good things of Egypt. And the people of Israel also began to complain. Oh, for some meat, they exclaimed. We remember the fish we used to eat for free in Egypt. For free? And we had all the cucumbers and melons, and that for free. I got to pull over there and park for a minute. That's like a convicted criminal in jail saying, I get dinner, I get 3 square meals and a bed for free in here. These people were slaves, but they think they were eating for free. And we had all the cucumbers and melons and leeks and onions and garlics we wanted. You can keep those melons, by the way. But now our appetites are gone. All we ever see is this manna. All we ever see is this manna. Now here's what I want you to notice, where the murmuring rises from. It calls them the foreign rabble. Now who is that? This was the group of people traveling with Moses and the Israelites who were not pure Hebrew. Probably included a few Egyptians. Definitely would have included a few foreign slaves that were neither Egyptian nor Israeli. Definitely, for sure, included some descendants of Hebrews who intermarried with Egyptians. But this foreign rabble were all heavily influenced by Egyptian culture. And this mixed multitude enjoyed the principle of freedom, but not at the price of faith. They wanted freedom, but they were accustomed to the comforts of Egypt. And there's so many messages there for us to consider. I think about in the American Revolution, it was an uncomfortable time. The people wanted freedom from British rule and from the king, but it wasn't easy. Many of them gave their lives, and it was a hard lifestyle, and the first groups that came over didn't usually survive. Think of the prisoner, for instance, who longs to be free, but he isn't ready for the responsibilities. He's comfortable with the 3 square meals and the warm bed he gets in prison. Hey, it requires no effort of a person to be a slave. That's one of the reasons why there is such a high reincarceration rate, is because sometimes it's easier to just stay in prison than to live out in the real world and deal with the complications as well as the beauties of freedom. And let me just toss this in right here. The same is true for a slave to sin. There are some folks who just hate the bondage they are in to drugs, hate the bondage they are in to sex, or deadness in a job, or an abusive relationship. But they so fear the unknowns that giving it up or leaving it would bring that they stay anyway. That's this mixed multitude, this foreign rabble. They wanted both the safety and security of Egypt and the blessings of God at the same time. But that's not how it works. If you want the blessings and promises of God, you got to believe enough to leave the old behind and enter a new land. So the Hebrews were grumbling, we're tired of manna. How about some meat and potatoes? We want some variety. And Moses got mad at the people. And he said to the Lord, why are you treating me, your servant, so harshly? Have mercy on me. What did I do to deserve the burden of these people? Did I give birth to them? In other words, these are your people. God, I didn't do this. I was happy out in the wilderness by myself with my little small family when you came in a burning bush and spoke to me. I didn't bring them into the world. Why did you tell me to carry them in my arms like a mother carries a nursing baby? How can I carry them to the land you swore to give to their ancestors? Where am I supposed to get meat for all these people? They keep whining to me, give us meat to eat. I can't carry all these people by myself. The load is far too heavy. Now, God is going to deal with the people momentarily. But first, he has to deal with Moses. And so he deals with Moses first. And I don't have time to go through this next part of the passage because in all of these lessons I have to pick and choose what I think is the most valid part of the book and then move on. But in a nutshell, quickly, the easy answer was for Moses to delegate, but that answer causes another problem. You just can't share your leadership in ministry with anyone and everyone, and God has gifted Moses in a way he hadn't gifted other people. It's fairly easy to find warm bodies to whom you can delegate tasks and assign duties, but it's much harder to find people who will assume responsibility. It was then, it still is today. And the greatest ability is dependability. It just is. So Moses needs more than just glorified gophers. He needs men who will think the way he thinks and care the way that he cares and sacrifice the way that he sacrifices. He needs men who will catch his vision, and he knows that. It's one thing for a person to step into a spot on a schedule, but another thing for a person to have a passion and step into a circle of responsibility. That requires a work of the Holy Spirit of God in one's heart. So God tells him, gather 70 elders to the tabernacle, and he fills them with the Spirit. And so this is the first of 2 times in the Bible that Moses says, I'm overwhelmed. And on this instance, God gives him help. On another instance, his father-in-law Jethro gives him help. Now God turns to the people. Had to deal with Moses first. You got to take care of that leader if he's upset. You better deal with that first. And so he turns to the people. While they were gorging themselves on the meat, he gave them meat, quail from the sky. While it was still in their mouth, the anger of the Lord blazed against the people, and he struck them with a severe plague. So that place was called Kibroth Hattaavah, which means graves of gluttony, because they buried the people who had craved meat from Egypt. Keep in mind, again, this is that foreign rabble, or that mixed multitude that had grumbled. Now, I'm going to mention something now that came up in another book 2 or 3 Wednesday nights ago, but since it's right here in Numbers, what happens next is Moses marries a Cushite woman, which Cushites were from Ethiopia. And we don't know for sure. The Bible doesn't tell us. Moses had a first wife named Zipporah. We don't know. Perhaps she had passed away at this point, but Moses marries a Cushite woman. And it seems that the complaint here that his brother and sister make, Miriam and Aaron, it had something to do with the fact that his wife was an Ethiopian. And since Ethiopians are black-skinned, it's possible, even likely, that Aaron and Miriam were guilty of racial prejudice here. Why is a Jew marrying a black woman? They may have said then. Listen, racial bigotry and racial prejudice didn't start in the American South in the 17th century. It didn't. It can be traced back to the beginning of the races. As soon as someone noticed that humans come in different colors, it was always suggested that one color was better than another. Remember this, racial prejudice is not a skin problem, it is a sin problem. Period. And you're about to see that here. Miriam and Aaron said, has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Hasn't he spoken through us too? And then is this key 5 words, but the Lord heard them. I think it would do us all well to remember those 5 words all of the time. We act like God's not listening. We act like God can't hear us. What a statement. Now, this is an enormous statement that God hears everything is going on. Israel had grumbled about the menu. In the next chapter, they grumble about the mission. Here they are grumbling about the messenger, Moses, and what he has done. And it's his own family questioning their brother's God-given authority. It's sort of sad, but church members today complain about the same three issues when they complain: the manna, the mission, and the marching orders. Or you could say the menu, the mission, and the messenger. And seldom do people just stand up and come right out and complain, thank God for that. But it goes on in little huddles or private conversations or telephone calls or text, you know. You go to lunch with a friend and have roast preacher or fried elder, and, you know, it goes on more that way. But that's why the last part of verse 2, always remember whenever we're talking, the Lord heard them, the Lord hears it. And so, the next verse, critical verse. Now, Moses was very humble, more humble than any other person on earth. I got to pull over there and park for just a second just to say that we certainly do not believe Moses wrote this. Wouldn't it be interesting for the most humble man on earth to brag about his own humility? We think this is one of those instances where Joshua comes back in and makes, certainly that'll come up again the next week. That'll come up again next week in the book of Deuteronomy, where definitely we think Joshua came in and added some words to the manuscript. But we think this is one of those cases either. But Moses was humble. Nobody had more clout with God or authority with man than Moses. He never forgot where he came from. And he was that way all his life. And he knew he was nothing without God. And so, God is pretty upset with Miriam and Aaron. And Miriam must have been the lead rebel, because God takes out a punishment on her first, and a pretty heavy punishment on her. The Lord was very angry with them. He departed, and as the cloud moved from above the tabernacle, there stood Miriam, her skin as white as snow from leprosy. Wow. And so Aaron apparently is no dummy. He gets it. When Aaron saw what had happened to her, he cried out to Moses, "Oh, my master, please don't punish us for this sin we have so foolishly committed." What do you want to bet he said us, he meant me? Don't let her be like a stillborn baby already decayed at birth. God hears Moses' request and heals Miriam. She has to spend 7 days outside the camp, just like all lepers did. And then he heals her after the seventh day. And so God forgives her and heals her, but not without making his point. Racial prejudice is like a leprous spot, not on the body, but on the soul. So the really big event in the book of Numbers that affects everything that happens in the book of Numbers and everything that happens in the book of Deuteronomy starts in chapter 13. As Israel is camping on the south border of the Promised Land at Kadesh Barnea, Moses sends 12 spies into Canaan to investigate the people and the land and the cities that lie ahead of them so he can make a battle plan. He has already organized the camp. Every time they travel in a certain order, an organization. Every time they camp with the tabernacle and the presence of God in the middle of them, the tabernacle is surrounded by, so everything is organized, and now he's going to plan and organize, and he's going to war game, you might actually say, for their invasion. And so he sends these 12 spies, and after 40 days, they return to report on what they have discovered. And 10 of the 12 spies focus on the problems in Canaan. The people are powerful and huge. The cities are walled and large. And one of their summations is, we can't go up against them. They're stronger than we are. So they spread this bad report about the land among all the Israelites. The land we traveled through and explored will devour anyone who goes to live there. All the people we saw were huge. We even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak. Next to them, we felt like grasshoppers. And that's what they thought too. We can't do it. We can't do it. We're like Randy, and they're like Shaquille O'Neal. We just can't do it. But two of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, interrupt. And they focus on the possibilities. And their answers are quite different. They said to all the people of Israel, the land we traveled through and explored is a wonderful land. And if the Lord is pleased with us, He will bring us safely into that land and give it to us. It is a rich land flowing with milk and honey. Do not rebel against the Lord and don't be afraid of the people of the land. They are only helpless prey to us. They have no protection, but the Lord is with us. Don't be afraid of them. Wow! You could not have two different reports. Be like reports coming on a war game from the Republicans and the Democrats today. You could not have two more difficult reports or different reports. They're helpless to us. One says, we're like grasshoppers, they're like giants. The other says, they're helpless in our sight. And so the people have got to choose. They absolutely have to choose. Joshua and Caleb believed with all of their heart that when God is on our side, the enemy is helpless and outnumbered regardless of how big or how many they are. God hears their complaining and He plans to destroy the people again. He's so tired of their constant. You ever been around somebody who complains all the time? Everything's negative, 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 negative. You see them coming and you think, oh, what's wrong now? That's the way God was with the Israelites. And the Lord said to Moses, how long will these people treat me with contempt? Will they never believe me? Even after all the miraculous signs I've done. And I'm not trying to play God, but I can just imagine God is sitting there going, oh, wait a minute. They have just watched me take them out of Egypt away from Pharaoh. They have just watched me open the Red Sea in front of them and let them go across while I then brought the waters back together and destroyed Pharaoh and his armies. They have just watched me take them to the foot of Mount Sinai where I personally appeared to their leader Moses and gave them the 10 Commandments and rules and moral law and civil law and ceremonial law for them to live by. They have just watched me drop manna and quail morning and evening, and they still don't believe me. So I will disown them and destroy them with a plague. Then I will make you, Moses, into a nation greater and mightier than they are. Now you understand what he's saying here. I'm going to destroy them. There will be Abraham's seed gone. I'm going to start over with Moses. But it is Moses who intercedes for the people before God. And his argument in chapter 14 is fascinating. Because here's what he says, paraphrased. God, if you wipe them out, what will the Egyptians think? They survived all the plagues. They escaped Egypt miraculously through the Red Sea, and now you're going to wipe them out? What will the Egyptians think? And then he adds in a second form of logic. He said, what will all the other nations who have heard about your might and your power think? And so God decides not to destroy them, but He afflicts what just might be an even worse punishment on them. The Lord said in chapter 14, all right, I will pardon them as you have requested. But as surely as I live and as surely as the earth is filled with the Lord's glory, not one of these people will ever enter the land. They have seen my glorious presence and the miraculous signs I performed, both in Egypt and in the wilderness, but again and again, they have tested me by refusing to listen to my voice. Only two in the entire group, not just two of the 12 spies, only two in the entire group over the age of 20. Joshua and Caleb, the positive spies, would survive to enter the promised land. And those two will later, much later, 40 years later, lead the conquest of the promised land. I cannot say this strongly enough. Clearly, the majority is not always right. It's not always right. In the end, the Hebrews feared the obstacles of the Canaanites more than they feared the Lord. I like what Hudson Taylor once said. It is not so much the greatness of our troubles as the littleness of our spirit which makes us complain. That was God's people. Only Joshua and Caleb focused on the opportunities rather than the obstacles. Only two men saw the grapes, the giant grapes, and not the giants themselves. Which tells us that when we are facing any kind of giant in our life, we must keep our eye on the Lord. And so this passage is how an 11 or 12-day walk turns into a 40-year death march. And the application it leaves for you and me today is the longest detour we'll ever take is at the fork of unbelief. Doubt and disobedience always creates a detour. Faith always ultimately receives the reward. So, get this. 38 years transpire between Numbers chapter 19 and Numbers chapter 20. 38 years. What happens during those 38 years? Absolutely nothing. The Israelites wander through the wilderness for 38 years. They spend 38 years walking around in circles. No progress is going to be made until the old geezers, the Exodus generation, dies off. It was the longest funeral procession in history. For 38 years, at least 100 people a day die. I think I'd have rather just been struck dead back there, wouldn't you? That's why I said maybe the punishment was even worse this way. Can you see, part of my job is dealing with terminal illness and death, and funerals, memorial services. And can you imagine having over 100 of those a day? Every time you break your camp, circled around the tabernacle to move to nowhere, wandering around in nowhere, 4 or 5 more people have died. Wow. And then in chapter 20, they've wandered around for 38 years between chapters 19 and 20. And in chapter 20, they arrive right back where they were in chapter 1, verse 1. The same exact place. Kadesh Barnea. the same border town from which the spies were sent out into the land 38 years before. They have returned, you might say, to the scene of the crime. Here is where the first generation buckled under to unbelief. Rather than having faith, they were overcome with fear. And now they are short of water, and they began to complain about that. And so the Lord said to Moses, you and Aaron must take the staff and assemble the entire community as people watch. I want you to speak to the rock over there, and it will pour out its water, and you will provide enough water from the rock to satisfy the whole community and their livestock. So, wow. That's what had happened before in Exodus chapter 17. This time, God tells Moses to speak the rock, not strike the rock. And instead, Moses gets the people together and says, listen, you rebels, must we bring you water from this rock? Now, here's what I want you to do in the next 2 minutes. 2 minutes. I want you to not forget one word. That word. You got that? What is the word I want you to remember for the next 2 minutes? All right. Must we bring you water from this rock? Then Moses raised his hand and struck the rock twice with the staff, and water gushed out, so the entire community and their livestock drank their fill. Moses was told by God, speak to the rock. Instead, he strikes the rock because he's mad. And God is going to refuse to let an impulsive and ill-tempered leader rob his people of a blessing. He'll deal with Moses later. But for the moment, he blesses his people so they can have water, and water flows from the rock. And by the way, let me say, I think that's often the case. At times, I think God blesses a church not because of the leader or the leaders, not because of the preacher or the staff or the elders, but in spite of them. Just because water is flowing in a church and good things are happening doesn't mean God is validating my faithfulness or the elders' faithfulness. God may just want to bless his people, and he'll deal with us later. That's what he does here. It's a very significant event. And so now, after giving them the water, he says to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust me enough to demonstrate my holiness to the people of Israel, you will not lead them into the land I'm giving them. Wow. Is that a little too harsh? For this guy that's done all that he's done? Hey, to me, in my humanity, I'd say probably was. But Moses had made a couple of very costly mistakes. And one of his mistakes is perhaps any Christian leader's greatest mistake. He misrepresented God. He came out screaming at the Hebrews, calling them rebels. Now, these people were God's children, his chosen nation. For God to call them a rebel would have been one thing. For Moses to do it is another. They're not Moses' children. They're God's children. You see, I can call my children or grandchildren anything I want to. You better not try it. We could have an issue. And so Moses misrepresented God, and it cost him severely. And I think his punishment was a profound lesson for the Hebrews. Nobody is exempt from obeying God and doing God's will, not even Moses. The verse in the Bible that personally scares me more than any other verse is James 3:1. It says, "Not many of you should become teachers, my brothers, for you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness." Now, I teach a lot. There was a time before I moved here in McMinnville, Tennessee, where my secretary said, "You spoke 542 times this year." Between a daily radio program and other speaking engagements and all the services of the church, she said, "You spoke 542 times this year." Right now, I am speaking to pretty much the same crowd 3 times a week, a little over 2 hours a week. That's a lot of words. That's a lot of opportunities to really screw up. And that's why that verse scares me, because I'm aware that I will be judged more strictly than those of you who are not teachers. God holds the leader and teacher to a higher standard, just like he did with Moses. And ministry is full of frustration. People sometimes are apathetic and don't want to serve. It's getting harder. It has gotten harder every single year. And you try to fix people and they won't stay fixed. And it's a hard thing to do. We're tempted to lose our patience. We're tempted to lose our optimism. We can blow our lids. We can come unglued in the name of Jesus. We can lose our composure and get angry. Sometimes we can become resentful at the same people God loves and that we have been called to serve. And so we have to be very careful as speaking for God that we do not misrepresent God. My job, and I try real hard at this, my job is not to express my opinion. My job is not to express my politics. My job is not to express my preferences. My job is to represent God's eternal truth like we're doing right now, straight through the book. Every book in the Bible. To be a faithful ambassador for God. That is my job. Now, chapter 27 is the end of the road for Moses. And in the last days, what preoccupies Moses' attention? Well, let me tell you what preoccupies him. Making sure a spiritual replacement is in place. The Lord told Moses, "Take Joshua, the son of Nun, who has the Spirit in him." No. I told you to remember a word. What was the word I told you to remember? Here I moved on. Look at me. I got to go back. All right. It just occurred to me. You know what another one of Moses' sins was? Who's we? Who is we? Was Moses bringing any water from a rock, either by speaking to it or striking it? That's a pretty big presumption there, don't you think? And a lot of scholars believe that was the key thing that ticked God off. Has Moses gotten to the point where he thinks it's God and Moses doing this? Well, I got a lot, but I got to move. So, anyway, I think this verse reveals Moses' heart more than any other instance. Moses has done all he can do. He knows he's about to die. He knows Joshua is going to lead them into the promised land. Moses, don't you think it's time for you to worry about you for a little bit and for a change? But Moses cares about Israel. He asked God to raise up a new leader who will be a spirit-filled leader. That is the most important thing on his mind. Very quickly, let me summarize this up. 2 tribes, Reuben and Gad, decide that they want to camp on the other side of the promised land and build their homes there. And Moses thinks that they're saying that means they don't want to go into battle. And here we are back 40 years ago at Kadesh Barnea. But that's not what they mean at all. They said, no, we just like this land better. We'll go in and fight the battle with the other 10 tribes, and then when we're through, we'll come back to there. And then there comes probably the best known verse in the book of Numbers. Moses said to them, okay, you can do that, but if you don't come back and fight, then take note, you have sinned against the Lord, and be sure your sin will find you out. It sort of reminds me of the mom who went to visit her single son, and she was surprised to find that her son John's new roommate was a girl named Julie. And of course, he assured her they were just friends, nothing immoral going on between them. Several weeks after she had left on her visit, Julie mentioned to John one day, ever since your mom visited, I've been missing that silver gravy ladle that we used to serve dinner. Do you think your mom took it? John said, I don't think so, but I'll ask her. And so he called his mom and he said, Mom, I'm not saying you did take the gravy ladle from our house, and I'm not saying you did not take the gravy ladle from our house, but the fact remains that one has been missing ever since you were here for dinner. And she said, well, dear son, I'm not saying that you do sleep with Julie, and I'm not saying that you do not sleep with Julie. But the fact remains that if she were sleeping in her own bed, she would have found the gravy ladle by now. Or, as Moses said, be sure your sin will find you out.